And good evening, depending on where you are located. So today we start in the third day of ISARM conference. So I would like to welcome to everybody, attendees, and also, of course, the panelists. I would like to remind that the title of this session 9 will be Governance on Transboundary Aquifers, Strengthening Cooperation. This session will be chaired by Viviana Rey, Assistant Professor of the Earth Sciences Department of the University of Pisa, that I would like now to give the floor to her and to have a very excellent session. The floor is yours, Viviana. Thank you.
Thank you. Greetings and welcome everyone to this session. In this session, we will have 4 presentation and 3, like 4 full presentation and 3 flash presentation. I would like to remind the audience that you're very welcome to ask questions in the chat, and we will have sufficient time for discussion at the end of all the presentation. You can also follow the session either in English or in French, thanks to the simultaneous translation. And then I'm very happy to give the floor to the first speakers for today's session, Mr. Hans Bickham, which is the Director of Aqua BW, that will talk about transboundary diagnostic analysis of the Eastern Kalahari-Karoo transboundary basin aquifer system. Hans, the floor is yours and welcome. The microphone.
Right. I want to share the screen. Let me share. I think some things go wrong. Can you see my screen?
We see the screen, but yes, we see the screen.
Okay, let me just quickly get my presentation. Sorry, it's coming up. Okay, good morning to you all. You can see my my first slide, yeah?
Yes.
Let me just take this off, yeah? For this presentation, I would like to give you an overview of the results of a transboundary diagnostic analysis of the Eastern Kalahari-Karoo transboundary aquifer system, briefly abbreviated by EKK TBA. The transboundary aquifer is shared between Botswana and Zimbabwe, and below you will see the let's say a diagram with all the collaborators and the experts in the project: Sam Sunguru, Piet Kinabatu, Kevin Peterson, Penny Sitole, Derek Weston, Luc Chevalier, Timothy Dube, and Tokosani Kanyere. Now, this TDA formed a crucial part of a project on water resource management research in the EKK TBA for the SADC Groundwater Management Institute, which was funded by the World Bank. And it was carried out over the period of April to November, December 2020, in the time that we really were affected by COVID-19. So we couldn't do any field work. And it was basically done online with all the collaborators. The main objective of the program was to provide a basis for enhancing and strengthening the understanding and the establishment of a platform for joint management of the EKK TBA. The TDA is a technical analysis of transboundary problems for those ones who are not yet familiar with it, on impacts and causes. And the main aim is to derive key messages from various thematic areas, detailed studies on the areas, for instance, of demography, etc. So much broader than only on groundwater, from which basically key issues emanate, and those key issues form an input into a strategic action planning process. And that basically is a really precursor for implementation in order to improve the management of water resources in the basin. If we focus on the TDA, we looked more critically at the system boundary of the EKK TBA. We collected data and information and analyzed these. We identified and prioritized the issues and transboundary problems and we developed a whole set of thematic reports. Now, as a background, you will see on the, let's say, on the left-hand side on the slide, you will see the reddish demarcated area, which is the EKK TBA, which was originally demarcated in 2010 through the hydrological mapping project in SADC. It was estimated at 34,000 square kilometers and inhabited by 240,000 people with a rainfall regime less than 500 millimeter per year. So we are dealing with a semi-arid area. Now, in the beginning, we had a workshop to identify, first of all, shared water risks, being the insufficient potable water, groundwater over-exploitation, pollution, competing sectoral demand for water, climate variability and change, data and knowledge gaps, institutional gaps and barriers, and inadequate, let me try to get this down. Let me see how I can get it down. An inadequate groundwater monitoring. Now, if we focus on the boundary, we looked at the to really have a critical review. We looked at data information. We did a thorough quality control. We looked at lithostratigraphy and tectonics. We looked at groundwater levels from the whole area, from various boreholes, and set up a regional piezometry, from which we basically redefined the boundary. Now, if you look at the left-hand side of the slide, you will see now the spreading of boreholes where we got our information from the borehole databases, which were publicly available, where most of the boreholes are confined towards the southern and southeastern part of the area. So most of it basically is without any data. We should know that let me just close it down. We should know that the depths to the static water level may represent different aquifer units. And we found that the information on lithology is poor. We also found that information on groundwater salinity is lacking for both Zambia and Zimbabwe. Then we looked at the lithostratigraphy and tectonics, and we found that obviously the lithostratigraphy is similar across all the Kalahari-Karoo basins in Southern Africa, going from southwest to northeast, Aranos Basin in Namibia towards the Mid-Zambezi Basin in Zimbabwe. And that suggests basically, from a geological perspective, a larger EKK TBA area. Now we're dealing again with a multi-layered aquifer system of superficial Kalahari group sediments and a deeper Karoo supergroup sediments, more in a confined aquifer system. Now from a, let me just try to get this out. Yeah. From a regional piezometry perspective, we looked at most boreholes, but they were shallow and abstracted groundwater from the Kalahari group. We found that groundwater flow mimics the surface topography, which again suggests a much larger area for the EKK TBA. Now we looked at groundwater divides, converging, diverging, flow patterns, etc., and we delineated now a new boundary, a provisional boundary in yellow dots. Now, if we further exclude the outcropping basement rocks, you will see now a new boundary, which is much larger at the moment than the originally demarcated area, superimposed on the latest hydrogeological map. And on the lower side, you see the drainage pattern. On the right-hand side, you see a digital elevation model, which shows you that the area is relatively flat, except for the western part, the eastern part, which is more hilly. Now, this new EKK TBA at the moment really accounts for much more for the hydrogeology of the area, and it's more than triple its original size, and is now about 127,000 square kilometers. It includes the Nyamodluvu area, which is important for water supply of Bulawayo City in Zimbabwe. It includes the Makgadikgadi pens in Botswana, and includes major mines and well fields also in Botswana. So it becomes much more relevant, but it was based on hydrogeological assessments. It also now includes parts, and that's quite new for an aquifer basin, parts of two river basins, the Okavango and the Zambezi River basins. Then we further analyzed various thematic areas, and I will give you just the highlights of these. And from a demographic point of view, based on hydrocensuses done in the two countries in 2011 and 2012, the overall population is around 500,000. But the overall population will double by 2015 based on population growth projections, which of course mean that the pressure on both land and water resources will increase. Now on the right hand side, you see a number of things basically as key messages. We developed key messages for each thematic area. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but we did it for socioeconomy as well as for health. From a climate perspective, we analyzed 5 data on temperature and rainfall from 5 meteorological stations in the area and compared these with a time series of 50 years from the Climate Research Unit, and they resembled quite well. In the middle part, you see a general trend of increasing temperature and a decreasing trend based on GRACE satellite data, gravity data, in equivalent water height as such. Now, key messages coming out of it is again that access to data is difficult. The data quality is a major issue, and there's a high interannual rainfall variability and an increasing temperature. From a surface water perspective, there was not much because most of the area is dominated by groundwater. But we found that data quality again being a major issue, most rivers being ephemeral, and the surface water groundwater interaction is relatively small, as you can see on the right-hand side through base flow analysis. From a groundwater perspective, I'm not going too much in detail. My colleague Samson Guru will present tomorrow, 11 o'clock, much more in detail on the hydrogeology. You see fence diagrams and a profile, and in general, groundwater flows from the flows towards the Maghari Pans. And this was also confirmed from local and more, let's say, localized well fields. So we tried to upscale local information to a basin level and being verified by peer-reviewed journals, articles, and technical reports. Key messages coming out of this thematic area is that, again, data quality is generally poor, groundwater development being localized, there's inadequate monitoring and upconing of saline groundwater, and institutions lacking the resources for effective and efficient management and monitoring. On the water use side, we looked at the various sectors, and in summary, you see here a pie chart where the majority of the water use is from groundwater, mining 63%, domestic 22%, and agriculture 15%. There's groundwater over exploitation, especially with regards to if you look at the water supply in mining, is demand driven and tends to negate sustainability of supply, which is an important thing to consider. From a land use and land cover perspective, the area faces negative environmental threats due to poor land use practices and climate variability and change. There's land degradation, and obviously we need to better protect the area to ensure the preservation of the natural habitats and biodiversity. Lastly, groundwater governance. We focused on this because groundwater is the main source of water. We found there's definitely a need for bilateral agreement arrangements to manage the EKK TBA, for instance, through the SADC water sector institutional framework. That brings me to the last slide on key issues, which is basically the result of all the analysis through the transboundary or to the transboundary diagnostic analysis. The TBA analysis resembled pretty close to let's say the outcome of the first workshop, but then of course in much more detail. And we the following key issues out of these analysis emanated in relation to water insecurity, in relation to data and databases, in relation to land degradation and groundwater governance and management. We did a gap and barrier analysis to get a broader perspective of water-related issues. We also did a causal chain analysis of key transboundary water issues. we developed mitigation measures, and we formulated only a few quick win measures. And this basically is, in a nutshell, just to give you a full idea of an overview of what we did in a very data scarce area. So that was the biggest challenge we were facing. So with this, I would like to end this presentation, thanking basically the SADC GMI staff for their excellent support and guidance, the focal persons and colleagues at the relevant ministries. OCACOM and ZAMCOM, we had to deal now in this case, which is quite exceptional, with 2 river basins, and the participants to the various workshops. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hans, for the very interesting presentation. And I think there will be a lot of questions that will be raised. And you gave a lot of food for thought and a great example that you showed us. So thank you again. I would like now to welcome the second presenter for this session, Ziad Kayat, which is coordinator of the Integrated Water Resource Management for Improved Water Security at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. The title of the presentation will be Strengthening Cooperation on Transboundary Aquifers in the Arab Region. If you can, Hans.
Thank you, Vivian. Hans would need to stop sharing so I can share my presentation.
Hans, you should stop sharing the presentation.
Yes, I know, but I have to find where I can stop the sharing.
It should be in the Zoom app.
Yeah, I can see it now. Sorry for that.
Yeah. No, thank you. And
is it now stopped? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah, the floor is yours.
Okay. Just let me know when you can see the presentation.
Yes. It's now in presentation mode. Yes.
Excellent. All right.
Thank you.
Okay. So as Vivian mentioned, I'll be talking about strengthening cooperation on transboundary aquifers in the Arab region and looking at a multi-tiered approach that we've been supporting transboundary cooperation in the region for over a decade or for many years now. So basically just an overview of the water resources in the Arab region. It's one of the most water scarce region in the world, actually, with around 86% of the population in the Arab region living in water scarce or water absolute scarce countries, with many stressors making the situation worse. We have climate change effects, we have the agriculture sector with low efficiency and low productivity, using over 80% of the water resources. There's a high cost and an energy cost, as many countries are using non-conventional water resources in such as desalination to offset this water shortage. There's also a high population growth with increased urbanization. Most of the aquifers in the region of the large aquifers are non-renewable fossil aquifers, and that's another stress on the management. We have declining water quality and, of course, a high dependency on transboundary waters, on external waters in the region. So as a quick overview, so 2/3 of the freshwater resources in the Arab region cross one or more border. So 2/3 are transboundary waters. We have 27 shared surface water basins, with 14 out of the 22 Arab countries sharing one or other. But when it comes to groundwater, transboundary groundwater aquifers, all Arab countries except for Comoros share one of the 40 plus aquifers in the region. And the transboundary aquifers actually cover around 60% of the region. So the approach, as I said, has been multi-tiered on assisting in this cooperation in the Arab region. First, I'll talk about improving the knowledge base on this transboundary aquifers, and this was done through cooperation between UNESCO and the BGR in an inventory of shared water resources in Western Asia. So basically, this inventory was the first UN-led effort to take stock of the region's transboundary surface and groundwater resources in a systematic and standardized way, because most of the aquifers or transboundary aquifers were not well documented and information was scarce in this. So the objective was to identify and document the state of these transboundary water resources, improve the knowledge base and access to this information, because the information was scattered and was difficult to access in national databases. Also to along this information, availing this information knowledge base, there was an important objective was to create awareness and stimulate dialogue within these riparian countries on these transboundary aquifers, and also support regional processes on dialogue and water cooperation on these transboundary water resources. So the inventory actually provided information on 22 transboundary aquifer systems, most of which were not recognized as transboundary aquifers prior to that, and these were detailed in the inventory with all the information and mapping on that. So basically, the area that the inventory touched on was looking at all the groundwater and surface water of Western Asia, which covered all the countries there, all the Arab countries, and also covered Iran, Israel, and Turkey with these shared aquifers there. Now, the process, which was a very iterative and participatory process, I think the process is very important when we're doing something like this, for it to be participatory and involve the main actors. So basically, what started with, due to the lack of information, we started with providing the base information, doing a lot of the desk work and finding reports, national reports, regional reports, global reports, and providing a base for discussion. And then this information was shared with countries and focal points from countries, and in an iterative process, back and forth discussions and participatory approach, and having the countries sitting in meetings and discussing riparian countries with each other the information, until we reached a final publication that was ready to be shared with the public. After this long process of going back and forth, verifying the information, getting other information from national sources, and agreeing on what aquifers are shared, and then defining what the process would be. Now, the main challenges, as I alluded to, were basically that data and information available out there in the public was obsolete and outdated, and it was sometimes contradictory between countries, so that needed that participatory approach to verify this data and build on it. And another challenge was in a water scarce region, a lot of this information was classified. So it was really a challenge to get that information from under classification and to be shared. And a lot of it was in unpublished reports. And the level of detail that was available was also different between countries. So that was also another challenge of how to standardize that. And these are some of these challenges. But what happened when you had contradictory information from different sources, what we try to do is reflect as much as possible this and allow room for further discussion and dialogue as a process that was parallel to the producing this inventory. So this is the standard setup for each one of these transboundary aquifers. You had an introduction that we dealt with the basics, location, area, climate, and we had a section on hydrogeology of these transboundary aquifers, the groundwater use, looking at what's the use of this, and what was there available in terms of agreement and cooperation on all of these aquifers. So this was basically the setup of these chapters. Now, some of the key findings from this inventory that there were more transboundary water resources than was generally assumed or acknowledged by these countries. And the dominance of water quantity and its allocation, that dominated the discourse on transboundary water resources in the region. Water quality was deteriorated and it was neglected. The focus was mostly on quantity. The lack of data, accurate data, hindered joint management, and there was very limited cooperation on groundwater. Until now, there's in the region very few cooperation agreements. With the large aquifers in the region, one of the aquifers spanned 8 countries, had a length of 2,200 kilometers. We had to come up with new approaches to deal with these large aquifers and break them up into groundwater management units where cooperation would make sense. So these are some of the key findings. Another way that we're sort of supporting transboundary cooperation in the region is through supporting the regional cooperation initiatives through the League of Arab States. Now, in the League of Arab States, the Arab Ministerial Water Council has a water security strategy that was adopted in 2011. And this strategy called for legal agreements and arrangements to support the management of transboundary water resources among Arab countries. And there was a resolution in 2010 that called on ASCO to support the drafting of legal framework for transboundary water resources cooperation in the Arab region. So we supported that process from 2010. We drafted the legal framework for transboundary water cooperation in the Arab countries and supported dialogue on that framework from 2010 to 2016. Unfortunately, the countries could not reach an agreement on that and decided to change that legal framework into a format which was more of guiding principles for Arab cooperation on transboundary. And ASCO also supported the drafting of these guiding principles in 2016. And these are also still under discussions. And the last meeting was held earlier this year in June 2021 on these guiding principles in that. So that's another process that we've been supporting. Now, along these regional guidelines, there are good examples of cooperation in the region. We don't have time to go into them into details, but some of them are, for example, on the Northwestern Sahara Aquifer System, where their scientific cooperation and consultation mechanism occurs under the Observatory for Sahara and Sahel. We have for the Nubian Sandstone Aquifer, a joint authority for the study and development of the Nubian Aquifer. And in the SAC-DC Aquifer, there's actually a signed cooperation agreement between Jordan and Saudi Arabia. So there are some examples on these major aquifers of cooperation. There's a regional process. So these are two things. Also, another process that has been helping in the cooperation is actually the process of reporting on the SDG indicator 652 on transboundary water cooperation. And between the two reporting exercises, we've had actually an improvement in the number of countries reporting from 10 to 15 countries out of the 22 Arab countries, and also an improvement in the type of information provided and the depth and the richness of information provided in the reporting, which has been very positive. And what's clear is that wherever you have some sort of a cooperation arrangement, you see that the level of the indicator is very high. For example, if we take the Northwestern Sahara Aquifer between Algeria, Tunisia, and Tripoli, you can see the high value of the SDG indicator overall on the national. So that's something that's to look forward in these cooperation agreements, that information is easily shared between the countries, and that supports agreement. And this is for the groundwater component of SDG indicator 652 at the country level. You also see the high values between Algeria, Tunisia, and Tripoli, resulting from the cooperation on the Northwestern Sahara Aquifer. Now, what was striking from this reporting exercise, that a lot of the countries, or all of the countries actually, highlighted that the lack of information was really the main challenge and the highest priority for all of these countries to push forward cooperation on these basins. And if you look at the basin level, you can see that riparian countries were not reporting the same value. So this is a map that shows the SDG indicator at an aquifer level. And you can see that where you have a cooperation body, like in the Northwestern Sahara Aquifer, you had a unified value for the aquifer. But in other places, the riparian countries didn't have a cooperation agreement, and the values were not coherent between different basins. So that actually has pushed us to look at how to avail that information. And now we're embarking on what we're calling a Arab Groundwater Digital Knowledge Platform, which we hope will avail different information that's needed for transboundary cooperation. It's a place to have these different data, land use, groundwater data, aquifer data, hydrogeology data, climate projections, all in one place that would support the analysis needed for cooperation. And we're embarking on this right now with the ACSAT, the Arab Center for the Studies of Arid and Dry Zones. And hopefully this knowledge platform will give flexibility to do the analysis needed for cooperation and improve the availability and, more importantly, the access to timely data and timely analysis, multiple types of analysis data that's needed to help push forward this cooperation. And I'll end there, and thank you again for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ziad, for the presentation and for highlighting very important topics, challenges, and opportunities in very short time, and also for highlighting what was already stressed by Hans in the previous presentation, the importance of knowledge, access to data, and also sharing knowledge. I already see there are a couple of questions for you, but we will take all the questions at the end of the presentation. So also I would like to remind all the attendees that you can type your questions directly in the Q&A box, and then I will read the question to each speakers in the Q&A session afterwards. So thank you once again, Ziad. And I would like to give the floor now to the third speakers for this morning, which is Jennifer McKay, professor at the University of South Australia, who will give a presentation with the title Transboundary Aquifer Governance in Australian Law, Implementing International Law Principles. So we move completely from kind of topic and setting. So welcome, Jennifer. The floor is yours.
Hello, and thank you all. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, let me just... I did send my PowerPoint through. Please use the I did send my PowerPoint through.
Okay, sure, Jennifer, we can share it for you.
Can you? Brilliant. That would be better, yes. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is in Australia, a particular example of a groundwater sharing scheme that's particularly good in between two states, and look at it in relation to SDG 16 and the recent human rights to water and clean environment, and just make passing reference to the Charter from 1989 and the ILA draft principles. So is someone able to put my PowerPoint up?
Yes, just a second.
Okay, all right. So I think that the SDG, in summary, I think the SDG goal of creating accountable, inclusive, and effective organisations is more powerful than some of the items we've had in international law in the past. That's my view. And here we go. Oh, brilliant! Great. So that's my campus, and that's everything. So can I control it? The next slide.
No, we will control. Just please say next slide, and we will move forward.
Yeah, next slide. Thanks. That would be great. So that's my building on this side of this one, but oh, we go. Yes. Okay. Now, we have three major transboundary aquifers in Australia. There's the Great Artesian Basin, but the reality is there's not a lot of people there, or there's limited demand. But there is a plan to manage that as well. That is good. But we have two other groundwater sharing arrangements, one between in the north, and the one I'm talking about is the one in the south. So groundwater in the one that I'm talking about between South Australia and Victoria is the most important source of water for people and for agriculture, and it's the public water supply. So it's a very productive, rich area. So what happened was the states are independent in law. They might as well be countries in the way that they behave. So the states, there's this huge aquifer, and there's a line right down the middle which puts it, some in South Australia and the other in Victoria. And it's a huge, rich aquifer in an area where it's good climate, and that's the only source of water because it's limestone. So the states, South Australia and Victoria, set up a border groundwaters agreement, and then they updated it in 2005. And they used the agreement provides that the groundwater shall be shared equitably between the two states. And that's not equally, it's equitably, and it does depend on the demand. And the Victorian side has a greater demand. So in a way, that picks up the principle in the ILA Charter. Okay, could I have the next slide, please? So the principles that I'm going to look at is SDG 16, which operates, as you know, from 2015 to 2030. The human rights statement that came out very recently. It's a pity these are in a different format. And then a little bit about the charter and the draft articles. I noticed a lot of other people have talked about those. Could I have the next slide, please? The next slide. Oh, yeah, thanks. Okay, well, this is SDG 16, which I'm sure everybody almost knows off by heart now. But the promotion of peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, the provision of access of justice for all, and building effective, accountable institutions at all levels. Now, the SDGs, if we don't implement, get in each country, or in our case, each state, accountable and effective institutions that provide justice for all, then what is going to happen in the next few years is going to be a much more vocal civil society, as I'm sure everybody could reflect on their own experience. We have much more citizen activism around injustice, particularly about climate change generally at the moment, but even at the local level, there will be protests about unfairness. And so SDG 16 is fundamental to achieving all of the 17 SDGs. It's the fundamental concept of the whole thing. So I'm going to talk about what Australia has done in this transboundary aquifer, whether that provides justice for all, and whether it builds effective, accountable institutions. And within the rules that are there, just briefly, I can talk about it at length later on with other people, but just give you a bit of an idea of how it actually works. Okay, could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so there must be a delay. All right. Now, the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, as you all know, has been championed for many years. But finally, in October this year, the resolution was passed that to move beyond the false separation of environmental action and protection of human rights. It is all too clear neither goal can be achieved without the other. And that's right. Unless we have a way of achieving justice, and that might be, it doesn't mean everybody gets the same share, but it does mean that people understand how things are being allocated. And there's been a lot of that's been not very clear in many places in the world. But this is a good example of where the one in Australia is good. So this was a recent which says there's a false separation of environmental action and protection of human rights. No, one cannot be achieved without the other. Okay, the next slide, please. So that I summarize that as cooperation. Okay, now the Economic Charter for Europe is old, and as you might note, the act that we passed in Australia actually predates this, but it picks up talking about countries in Europe, but in Australia, what the systems have done is coordinate groundwater and surface water. Well, there's no surface water where I am, but it's the act in Australia has coordinated with best available technologies and economic instruments to share the water. Could I have the next one, please? Okay. Now, the provisions of the Charter should be applied in national groundwater legislation. Legal provisions specific should be formulated and promulgated. And this is exactly what Victoria and South Australia did. And it could maintain provisions for the effective implementation and the power of relevant authorities according to uniform principles. And that is exactly what they have done by state laws. And what they've done is they've got 3 people from each of the states form a committee, and that committee manages the groundwater in the most stressed part of this shared aquifer. And so it's a legal, very much a legal system. Could I have the next one, please? Right, and the Charter from 1989 talks about ownership. Now, in Australia, we didn't use the common law system about ownership, so we don't have that corruption that is a problem in many parts of the world. We said the Crown owned the groundwater, and then we did this in 1790, a few years after the British came here, and we and gave the government power to allocate the water, the groundwater and the surface water. So this whole thing about a government-controlled permit system was very much implemented in Australia. And then we went on to develop water markets, as you probably all know, and they initially were not very good for the environment because they gave an incentive for people to sell water that they weren't using. And then so we passed some other laws to say that the scientists work out how much groundwater can be used, and then the market system can only share what's left after the scientists say how much needs to stay in the groundwater system. So, but that system has been a bit corrupted as well, not because the scientists are corrupt, but because of the political game playing that's gone on. The next one, please. And then the draft articles on transboundary law of aquifers that you all know about is an ILA document. Could I have the next one? And that brings up equitable realisation and duty to do no harm, which our laws did also bring in. So in a way, we've sort of implemented them, and I know other parts of the world have many more conflicts. We were just within the one country, so then the point that I made then was the key to all of this is public participation in decision-making processes to achieve accountable, effective institutions and justice. And if we don't achieve that, we will get many more protests. And there's really not much of a defence for protesters in the common law system. And I think there's less of one in other parts of the world. So if people protest against policies about sharing of groundwater, the state can, there's not much defence. The next one, please.
Jennifer, you have 1 minute.
1 minute left. Okay, so SDG 16, can I have the next one? That's a summary of what I've said. Next slide. Okay, so the summary, the normative values are the back please. And the formatting's gone awry, I don't know why. Are the institutions between Victoria and South Australia inclusive? They're not, because they're only dealing with farmers. There is some overarching environmental protection law, but the actual mechanism for allocating the water isn't inclusive. It doesn't include all groups of society. Is it accountable? Is this scheme we've set up accountable? Well, there's no penalty if farmers in South Australia use more than they're told that they should use. There's at the government level, but at the individual level, the state could prosecute a farmer for using more of his allocation, but they don't tend to do it. Are they effective? Well, I think the group of having the 3 from Victoria, 3 from South Australia working on how much water can be used has been effective, but the caveat is that it's not very accountable or inclusive. Is it cooperative? Does it bring in a human rights approach? Well, again, yes, but as it's not, would need to be more inclusive to fully satisfy that. The reality is we haven't had that many people protesting or complaining about water use down there, but that could happen later on. The next one, please. And I'll finish then. It reflects irrigation interests, as I said, an NRM due to compliance with plans. It does not engage with broader values. So whilst it has worked in the context of broader values only now coming into the equation, such as spiritual and Indigenous attachment to land and water. That is the next step that will happen in the next little while. And if they use the same mechanism but broaden the decision-making, the boundaries of the decision-making to include those values, and they keep the same institution, then it would be better. And I think that's it. That's my last slide. Viviana.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and thank you also for your patience with the technical issue, and thank you for the organizing committee for the support.
Yes, Jennifer, and thank you to Mohammed particularly.
Thank you for bringing so many insights from a very different perspective from the pure, let's say, technical, ideological one. I think it's very important to stress the role that groundwater has in protecting peace and justice, the human right-based approach, and also the need to include also the local and indigenous knowledge. And I'm sure that we'll have time for talk a bit more about these points with the Q&A session. Yes. So thank you once again. And I would like to invite now our fourth speaker for this morning, Andreas Schädeler, from the groundwater expert from the Environment Agency of Austria. That would talk about transboundary groundwater bodies and monitoring networks of the Republic of Belarus and Ukraine, developed under the UWI Plus project. So Andreas, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Viviana. Do you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
So I would like to show you the work that was done to identify transboundary groundwater bodies which are shared between the Republic of Belarus and Ukraine. And this work was elaborated under the OIV Plus project. And in fact, the work was done, and I give the presentation today on behalf of the 4 groundwater experts, the 2 ladies from Belarus, which are Olga Pieroska and Olga Vazniova, and also from Ukraine, the groundwater experts were Natalia Lyuta and Irina Sanina. So they did the actual work, and we supported them in this work. And we supported them in the work in the frame of this European Water Initiative Plus project. It was a 5-year project. It was the biggest commitment of the European Commission in the water sector in the Eastern Partnership with almost 25 million euro. And it was implemented by OECD and UNECE, and then also by the International Office of Water from France and by the Environment Agency of Austria, where I'm working at. So the main objective of this activity of this project was to support the partner countries in bringing their national policies in line with the Water Framework Directive, and also to support also the other multilateral environmental agreements. And the work was not done by international experts. The work was done by the local experts and supported by the international experts. And here you see the 6 countries which were supported of the Eastern Partnership. It's Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia. So I just want to show you the work that was done in Belarus and Ukraine to identify transboundary aquifers, transboundary groundwaters. Here you see, and this work was implemented in the Dnieper River Basin. So here on the map, you see in the north, the Republic of Belarus, and in the south, you see Ukraine. And the dark blue area is the Dnieper River Basin. And the Dnieper River Basin is shared by Belarus and Ukraine. And this was the focus of our work. And you see it's more than 400,000 square kilometers large. So quite a huge challenge for us. And of course, within this Dnieper River Basin, there are several aquifers. And there is a need for the coordinated basis for the bilateral management of groundwater. So this was our starting point. And also, furthermore, the transboundary coordination is also required by the Water Framework Directive itself. So first step was that the groundwater experts did their homework. So they identified the aquifers and they identified groundwater bodies. When I'm talking about groundwater bodies, I mean the management units that are defined by the Water Framework Directive. They can be part of aquifers or they can cover several aquifers. So it's a pure management unit which is used then to implement the appropriate measures to improve groundwater quality and quantity. And this delineation was done by national experts with their own national approaches. And in the second step, all these aquifers and groundwater bodies were then characterized according to geology, hydrogeology, covering layers, main recharge source, Also to identify the important aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems that are linked to this groundwater or that are dependent of this groundwater. And of course, it's necessary to also identify the human pressures in terms of pollution, groundwater abstraction, and also the main impacts to the groundwater. And finally, we also assessed the monitoring network that was existing. This was done by each country individually. And then in the third step, country experts joined together and they identified the transboundary aquifers. So all the aquifers that are crossing the borders and also the groundwater bodies that are linked together over the borders. They exchanged GIS maps, they harmonized the boundaries, and they also exchanged the characterization information. So finally, this was the first result was the identification of the aquifers and groundwater bodies that are transboundary. And on these maps, these 5 different maps show the different aquifers that are overlying each other. So they are in different horizons. And when you look in detail at this, then you see the main problem that appeared. It's the size. So the size of these groundwater bodies or aquifers are so huge that it's not possible to have proper groundwater management. Because when you look at the part of which is lying in the Ukraine, then you see it is 600 kilometers large, or the distance from northwest to southeast is 600 kilometers, and the area is more than 100,000 square kilometers. So it's very difficult to manage this aquifer because it's not a uniform land use there. It's very different hotspots, very different land use. So you have to focus on that. And I personally doubt that the water drop from the southeast is really affected in the southeast of Ukraine is really affected by activities that are happening in Belarus, 600 kilometers away. So this was then the starting point. So I mentioned already, this is some parts of these groundwater groups do not even show a transboundary connection. So not all of the pressures in a groundwater body can cause impacts in neighboring groundwater bodies. And this means that not all activities need a transboundary coordination. So we need a more focused approach. And this was then the 4th step to identify transboundary corridors. So the corridors are defined as the zones where actual transboundary groundwater flow and the potential influence of effects of anthropogenic pressures take place. And both experts, the groundwater experts from Belarus and Ukraine, elaborated a methodology, and they decided to delineate a corridor extending over 50 to 55 kilometers at both sides of the borders. And this distance was chosen because of the characteristic of the groundwater bodies and the aquifers, because of the recharge areas, and also of the zones where there is water exchange in the areas where groundwater is discharged to the rivers. So when we look at just one example, you see on the left side, the big aquifer that is transboundary. And in the second step, these transboundary corridors were identified. So it is supposed by the experts that only the groundwater in this part, is really interacting over the border and affecting each other. So pressures on the Ukrainian side within this zone have the potential to affect groundwater on the Belarus side. And this exercise was then done for all the different aquifers that are transboundary in the different horizons. And this is the resulting map where you see all these transboundary zones, which are of interest for transboundary monitoring and also management. And in the 5th step of the work, the groundwater experts exchanged their data and information. They reviewed the characteristics and the characterization of these groundwater bodies, including the human pressures. They were again reviewing the monitoring network. Is there a monitoring network appropriate? And the proposal was that in Ukraine, there should be new monitoring sites. And then they proposed also a data exchange template. And finally, the outlook is that in the next step, those areas and those zones should be identified which are of major concern in terms of management. And this prioritization should be done by a risk assessment, because we do not want to waste time. We don't want to waste efforts and budgets. We want to focus on those areas that are really relevant and where management decisions should be taken and where measures should be implemented first. And with the fifth step, the work stopped during or under the OIV Plus project. But of course, this should be continued with this risk assessment and the monitoring and the data exchange and the status assessment. But this work initiated intensive bilateral coordination between the groundwater experts from Belarus and Ukraine, and it also paves the way for better transboundary coordination and better transboundary management of the groundwaters. So if you like to have some further information, then just have a look at the website of the OIV Plus project, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Andreas, for the interesting presentation and also for the for sharing this interesting project result. I personally really appreciated the stress you put on the focus for more coordinated and focused approach. And I think it's true that sometimes the time required for performing investigation and coordinating people is not matched by the need that people have of having clean water, safe water, etc. So there is something really we need to think more of. So thank you very much again. This was the fourth of the, let's say, long presentation. I would like just to remind everyone that you can type your question in the Q&A box and we will have a discussion afterwards. So we now move to the second part of the session, where we have three flash presentations. The first will be by Vidisha Roy, who is also present here today. So if you have a question for her, you can type in the Q&A box and she will be happy to answer. So the first video will be by Vidisha Roy and Anuruddha Roy, speaking of achieving SDG 6.5.2, transboundary aquifers, water governance in a new light.
Hello and welcome to today's presentation on the topic of achieving SDG 6.5.2 transboundary aquifer water governance in a new light by Vidisha and Anuruddha. Aquifer. The storage of water below the earth is equally important as flowing surface water like any river. Anthropogenic action often disrupts this system as it does with other parts of ecosystem. Every aquifer has its own boundary, as nature does not care about politics, so they often are spread across international borders. The boundary of the aquifer ecosystem cannot be divided by nationality, culture, countries or states' border, and politics. Nations depend on this precious natural resource for irrigation of agricultural land, for food, industry, mining, drinking water, and other domestic use. As one of the most densely populated part of this world, many Asian countries signed treaties among themselves to share river water without any ambiguity. Few of them are listed on the slides. These countries also set up River Commission for resolving issues and enforce these treaties smoothly. However, as an invisible natural resource, transboundary aquifers are failing to draw attention. Aquifers are never part of these treaties. While aquifers provide a valuable base flow for the river for survival and surrounding ecosystem to thrive. Aquifers are suffering from climate change as well. The changing precipitation patterns, variation of temperature, sea level rise, and soil erosions impacted the recharge and discharge zone of the aquifer. The dissimilar abstractions of water from the aquifer impacted riparian communities the most. The depletion of groundwater table is continuing despite all of these facts. In our study, we are focusing on a way of dealing with these arising issues. In these difficult times of geopolitics, climate change, and growing population, consensus must be made on sharing this natural resource without hampering the natural aquifers ecosystem anymore. Our study will be an initiative towards bringing all parties on the table to agree upon a common structure of sharing this resource. Thank you.
Thank you for the video and Vidisha for the presentation. We move now to the second fresh presentation. There will be another video by Kaloun Murad on the impact of climate change and groundwater and governance on groundwater resources in the Mejerda River Basin.
Good morning, everybody. I will talk about the impact of climate change on groundwater resources in the Mejerda River Basin. Transboundary groundwater resources are affected by the existing governance system in the neighboring state and the climate change. This research assessed the impact of climate change on the groundwater resources of the Mejerda River Basins shared between Tunisia and Algeria. We used a water evaluation and planning system considering two scenarios, RCB 2.6 and 6. At demand side were selected from 6 one from Algeria and 4 from Tunisia because most of the catchment is located in Tunisia. The climate change impact assessment was carried out using the GCM outputs coupled with other global scale data. The variation in groundwater storage and research under both scenarios showed a similarity in storage variation except for some months like April 2025 and July 2050. Some years showed an increase in groundwater storage while other years showed a decrease. In relation to the unmet demand, it was seen that the unmet demands were zero under the selected scenarios, which means non-renewable groundwater will be used due to the decrease in groundwater storage. To conclude, the WEEP system was used to evaluate the impact of climate change on groundwater resources under different climate change scenarios. The predicted simulation showed a decrease in groundwater storage, which highlighted the need to address climatic challenges and to propose a sustainable transboundary water resource management plan based on stakeholder involvement and regional cooperation. For recommendations, as we all know, climatic models are based on assumptions and predictions. Therefore, climate change impact on groundwater needs further research work assessment using other climate models to improve our knowledge regarding the way that climate change can impact the hydrological cycle and water use in Algeria and Tunisia. Moreover, governmental structure and cooperation framework need more studies for better sustainable transboundary water management in Algeria and Tunisia. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you also for sharing this presentation. And we have another example where we stress the need of improving the understanding and knowledge sharing. So we now move forward to the last flash presentation that will be given by Shami Puri, which is the former Secretary General of IAH and also the Managing Director of the Sustainable Solution in Practical Hydrogeology think tank. Shami will talk about the ILC draft articles, a governance scenario retrospective from 2060 based on alternative protection in 6 TBAs. Shami, the floor is yours.
Let me just share my screen, please. Give me 10 seconds. So I'm going to speak about trying to look ahead at the role of, all right. Thanks very much, Viviane. Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to speak to you. I think my screen is being shared, but I can't see it over there. I'm going to speak about what might be the future of the UN's International Law Commission's draft articles on the use of transboundary waters. And just wondering, they were adopted and they're put forward in the year 2008, but since then, there appears not to have been huge amount of progress in the sense that they have not actually been adopted exactly into various country. We still have got full screen. Okay, no question what's happening. We had full screen before. I hope you can see that anyway. So the idea over here is to present the retrospective. That's a pity we can't do this. Can we just do it again? Can we just try and do it again? Because I've got some animations over there. So what I'm going to try and do is to look at it from different perspectives. If we look at the perspective of the year 2030, and the reason we want to look at that from the year 2030 is because that's when we should have achieved the SDGs. And we can look at the SDG 5.6.2, which at the present time suggests that the countries are not actually on track on reaching and achieving their cooperation. And we can also look at it from the perspective of the year 2060. And the reason we want to look at it from the perspective of the year 2060 is because climate change modeling is trying to show to us that it's likely that that's when there will be potential problems in terms of the severe impact of climate change. So we want to look to see whether the current cooperation is on track, and we want to see how we can deepen engagement, and then we want to see how the current cooperation can be enmeshed into the UNLC's draft articles. And now the animation doesn't work. Okay, so we use 2030, and I think everybody's seen where we are in the year 2030. It looks as though the assessments that were done in the year 2018 and 2020, we show not sufficient progress. If we want to look at it from the climate megatrends, we can list the transboundary aquifers that we know of in which the annual recharge is very low, and they're listed on the left over there. I won't go through them. This is data taken from the TWAP and READ processed, TWAP being the Transboundary Water Assessment Program. And we can see that climate impacts, climate damage impacts are already being valued at the value of about $156 billion per annum as a result of that. And this data comes from the Swiss rate calculations. So we know that there's a link between climate and agriculture demand. So all those transboundary aquifers on the left-hand side, whose annual recharge is very low, I've listed all the ones that are less than 50 millimeters per annum, are the ones in which this megatrend, climatic megatrend, is going to focus, and there's going to be a severe impact. So those are the countries in which, and the transboundary aquifers, which action is needed quite quickly. We can also look at the development impact. Development impact is calculated as the ratio between the average annual recharge compared to the volume of water abstracted. And that shows us a listing of aquifers. And I've got them for all continents, but I'm displaying the ones for Africa primarily. We can see that the ones that are on the highest development impact are listed on the left-hand side, and some of those were presented today. And these are the areas in which really we need to have pretty quick progress, so that in about 20 countries of the world, we're facing a very high risk in terms of loss of resource from transboundary aquifers. How can we take this forward? Well, we can look at it in this transboundary governance framework. There's a three-nested box system. The outer box is the hydrogeology, and we've heard a lot of that today. The hydrogeological analysis of each transboundary aquifer resources, thickness, flow directions, and so on. We've seen quite a few examples. The next bit is the trust building measures, and we've seen some of those today as well. Countries are already starting to come together, and we saw there were some examples from the Karoo, and there's some examples from other areas of trust building measures are underway. And then the hydrodiplomacy. And hydrodiplomacy is not just blah, blah, and sitting, talking around a table, but it's actually making some kind of joint investments. And we haven't seen many of those. And if we want to try to move forward, we think that that is the way in which this is going to be a pretty critical issue. And then just classifying all those aquifers that are listed. This is a big table. I'm just showing you an example. Scoring all those three areas that I identified, looking at what their annual recharge is, it suggests where we are in terms of progress. So the A is good progress, B is on its way, C is not yet well done, and D is really awaiting. So the Northwest Sahara needs urgent action. Average annual rainfall is around about 16 millimeters. The East Lampred, Namibia, Botswana, very low annual recharge, but it is already on its way in the cooperation, and the rest of them is listed over there. So where do we go from here? What is it that is causing the hurdles in the inter-country dialogue, and do we still have what is called an invisibility cape? For the scientists, the invisibility cape is gone, because we've seen today and in this conference lots and lots of examples of people having studied the analysis. But for the foreign policymakers, those who do the inter-country diplomatic dialogues, they are still unclear what is it that we're talking about. And at this UN Sixth Committee meeting, some of the issues that we need to raise are still unclear to the diplomatic community. So for example, they don't understand what obligation not to cause significant harm means. And here's a comment from one of the country delegates. It lacks precision. It could be a bone of contention. When one is considering one kind of harm, it may be taken as very significant on one side, but not significant on the other side. And hydrogeologists need to convert this idea of significant harm. What is the drawdown? Is it significant? What is the loss of resource? How much is it? How many billion cubic meters is it? That's what we need to do. So we need to transform our assessments into tangible quantities which have an impact perhaps on GDP, so that the decision makers and the policy makers can understand this. My conclusion, therefore, is unless we do this next step, which is pretty critical, and it needs the multidisciplinary approach, the transboundary aquifers and the draft articles will unfortunately remain under the invisibility cape. And this is our task immediately and in the next 5 or so years. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Shami, for your very interesting and inspiring talk. And I think it's just perfect conclusion of this session, where we had the chance of addressing the issue of cooperation on transboundary aquifer. And it was stressed in all the presentation, actually, the importance of translating the scientific findings into something tangible, and also the inter and transdisciplinary approaches that needs to be adopted in general for groundwater assessment, but more specifically in the case of transboundary aquifer cooperation. So I would like to invite all the speakers to virtually join on stage again. We received quite a good number of questions. Some were already answered in the chat box by the speaker, but I would like to share them again for those who didn't have the chance yet to read. I also would like to stress that thanks to the conference app, you can get in contact with all the speakers and the panelists of the conference. So you can continue and get in contact also afterwards. So thank you again to all that asked the question, and to the speakers for their presentation. The first set of questions is for Ziad, who already typed some answer, but maybe he wants to add something more related on the input that was raised by one of the attendees on the need for the Arab region to focus on catching each drop of natural and artificial rain. And also if you can discuss a bit more in detail on the Iraq transboundary water management issue. Ziad, please.
Yes, thank you. No, definitely. I mean, we need to make, in a water scarce region, you need to make use of each and every drop. It doesn't need to be rain, but each and every drop of any source, to be honest. And it's not just a one-sided approach of increasing supply, but it's also an integrated approach of supply, demand, conventional and non-conventional resources. And this is what the region has been trying to do with different levels of success at different stages. What's important is to leverage the new innovative solutions and innovative technologies. Whether we're talking technologies, we're talking finance, we're talking management. The severity of the situation of water scarcity is only getting more complicated with climate change and climate change projections. What we've seen with the climate change projections and seeing the impact, we've done a few studies on the impact of climate change on groundwater, which has been unfortunately forgotten. Most of the focus has been on climate change impacts on surface water, but the impacts on groundwater have also been neglected a bit, and it's been shown that the effects are direct and indirect. Direct from the climate change effects, and indirect from more use of these groundwater with the variability and the declining in ability of surface water. So what's really needed in this region, again, I stress, it's not one approach, it's an integrated approach that addresses solutions that go beyond even the water sector, looking at cooperation with other, it's obvious, I mean, the water sector, the agriculture sector is an obvious target, but it's a multi-tiered participatory approach that's needed, critically needed.
Thank you. Thank you. Also in the chat, Robert Culling shared some articles about the research project in Iraq, and you also shared, one question was where to find more information about the result of your project, and those are available at waterinventory.org. Thank you. Another comment was for Jennifer McKay, for just stressing the importance of, thanking you for the insight on the legal framework on groundwater charter. And it's more common, but maybe you can share some more thoughts on that. The fact that actually legal framework should be considered in integrated water resource management among states. So this is something that is often not so taken into account. I don't know if you want to add something, Jennifer.
The legal, you need to have rules. As it is in our country, Victorian rules for managing groundwater are different to South Australian. And if you look on the slides, you'll see I talk about forestry. As you all know, forestry takes water out of the aquifer. In South Australia, that is regulated and is part of the water planning process. In Victoria, it isn't. So, they're discussing, at least for this region, bringing in a similar forestry regulation. So you do need the rule book to be the same. but of course that's very difficult to do even in our context, and it's more difficult to do when it's a different legal system. But I mean, the law isn't the law by itself won't work. You have to have people need to be participating in the decision making, so they understand what the scientific issues are. And the scientists have to be able to explain it to somebody of about, somebody of about 12-year-old sort of understanding. And once you explain it to people that you can't keep on taking water out of here forever, then you should manage to get the law to be accepted. I mean, you can have which would limit use. So I think the law is fundamental, but you have to explain the law to people or you'll just get anarchy.
Thank you. And this probably leads me to ask Shami what he thinks about this in terms of, because he also addressed the importance of talk to people, translate into something more understandable and tangible. This is part of the reflection that probably within the hydrogeological community has been discussed in the last few years or so. But I don't know, Shami, do you want to add something in this regard?
Sorry, Viviana, the sound is a bit off of here. Could you just repeat your question, please?
Yeah, the question is just wondering if you wanted to comment more on how actually to translate information for the civil society, for people, and how to also make more understandable this need for like inter-transdisciplinary approach, also spanning from the pure hydrogeological to the more legal, economical aspect of the transboundary cooperation.
Okay, I'm not sure I understood. The sound is a bit off over here. If we want to move, my main point is that we want to take our science to the community that makes the decision, in simple terms, because majority of our scientific community are conducting a very useful quantification, assessment, clarification, classification, and all that's very good. And we can make an assessment. We know where the aquifers are. We know the flow directions and so on. This is interesting to us, but it is not sufficiently useful to the decision maker who may or may not have the hydrogeological or even the water background, but he may be in a decision-making position. So he may be a socioeconomist, he may be an international legal expert, he may be in the foreign policy area. And when you want to come to negotiate between two countries or communicate between two countries, invariably, although the informal discussions can take place by all the communities of scientists and so on, the formal discussions are always led by these institutions, almost always by the ministries of foreign relations. So, and the evidence of that is when you go to the UN General Assembly, the people who adopt the UN draft articles for them to be then adopted by individual countries are diplomats. And you need to take the language of science to the language of socioeconomics and diplomacy. So they understand if you do not do X, Y, and Z, the impact on so many thousand hectares of our land and so many 100,000 people and so much of the GDP of that part of our country is at risk. And the question is, what is the risk? And that is what we need to try and convert. So a typical, I don't know whether you watched it, but we played a dialogue yesterday. And in the dialogue, I acted as the policymaker and Bob Callan acted as the scientist. And I was asking him, finance. And I'm glad you showed me all this three-dimensional flows and all this sort of business, but you tell me, why should I cooperate? And he was trying to explain the reason I would cooperate is that so many hectares and so many million people, et cetera, are going to lose their income if we don't do something quickly. And an example is, for example, the milk river aquifer in US and Canada. In the year 2020, they started an investigation. They built a three-dimensional model. Groundwater flow systems were analyzed. And you look at that stuff, and it's superb. It's fantastic for me as a hydrogeologist. But they say in 2020, they came to the meeting yesterday, and they said, oh, well, US and Canada have not got to any decision about what to do. And this, to me, is an example that we have not taken the message. So from that particular example, the message, briefly, I'm interpreting that, is that in Canada, where water is used for agricultural development and several $100 billion of annual investment, annual income is gained, that area is at risk because the recharge area happens to be in the United States. The United States doesn't really care about that area because they don't have any agriculture over there. This is where we need to transform the policy and inform the policymaker. This area of our country is likely to lose its resource, and in neighboring country is where they need to take the action because that's where the recharge takes place. And that's what we would want to do, enhance managed aquifer recharge, for example, and it would need an investment. Exactly analogical situation in the Stamford. In the Stamford aquifer in the middle of Namibia, the aquifer was overdrawn. Where's the recharge area? It's in Botswana. The collaboration now has to move to the stage where possibly one country says, well, you don't care too much about the recharge because it flows to our country. We will, for example, invest so many million dollars, whatever, to put in well fields or to put in recharge areas and manage aquifer recharge, etc., so that in time we benefit and we jointly benefit. Sorry, it's a bit long, but that's the kind of debate we need to move towards. Otherwise, we're speaking to ourselves. In 2010, when we had the first Congress, we were speaking to ourselves. In 2020, not so much, but we're still speaking to ourselves. We need to speak outside. And what is the language we need to use? I think I've illustrated that. Thank you.
Thank you, Shami. That's really interesting. A very good point that it's also part of the importance that was stressed in the other presentation as well by Jennifer, the need to address the issue and to act and not just to stay in our ivory tower, let's say. We still have a few questions, but I would like now to give the floor to Anuruddha Roy that would like to add some more comments about their presentation.
So it will be Bidisha who will be presenting.
Bidisha, okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no issues. Is there a way we can put the presentation on from our side?
Sorry?
Can we put the presentation from our side?
I'm asking to the UNESCO colleagues.
Yep.
Andreas?
Yes?
They're asking if you can put their presentation.
Yeah, we are preparing it.
Okay, sorry. In the meantime, if there are more questions, please type them in the Q&A box.
Can you see the presentation?
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah. Okay, thank you for this floor, and thank you for this sharing this presentation. I'm here. I think I cannot control the slides. So can you just move on this first slide? Okay, thank you. As we all know, this transboundary aquifer are not divided by political boundary, culture, or nationality. It is spread across international borders. As population increases, dependency on groundwater increases accordingly. In absence of transboundary cooperation, regard to water may increase the disruptions in many regions and push socioeconomic development in an unsustainable way further. Above all, climate change continues to degrade natural resources and making water resources more precious than ever. Sustainable Development Goal number 652 recognize transboundary water cooperation as a parameter in calculation of indicator and their progress. Thank you. TBA act as an invisible resource for social development and improving socioeconomic condition in riparian communities. Major anthropogenic activities found in the selected transboundary aquifer in the study, which consume groundwater or irrigation for agricultural land, industrial use, mining, and domestic consumption. National water policy play a key role in the institutional arrangement for a country that later reflects transboundary cooperation on water resource management. The country have mentioned clear direction about the future course of action in the water sector in their national level water policy, and the singular institute is responsible for implementation of that policy makes transboundary water cooperation successful. Subsequently, it provides clear direction towards the water governance in the region. Many countries in Asia are undergoing national water policy dialogue to adopt water policy at national level. Next slide, please. The study found that countries with lower GDP per capita have more proactive in the formation of national level policy and also signing transboundary water treaties with neighboring countries. However, countries with higher GDP per capita are still in the process of forming a national level water policy. Next slide, please. Thank you. In terms of transboundary agreement between countries for groundwater utilization, only Jordan and Saudi Arabia came into an agreement for the SUG and DC layer. The agreement is not spread across all of the transboundary aquifers shared between these two countries. In other ways, transboundary agreement or groundwater sharing or management is not present among 23 Asian countries which have been considered for the study based on the population density and area of the aquifers. However, most of the countries sign treaties or come into an agreement for the utilization or management of transboundary river water treaty. Recently, Iraq signed a memorandum of understanding with Turkey to ensure a fair distribution of water with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These agreements signed among countries mostly are not considering groundwater management separately. However, these river commissions and agreements signed between countries could be used as a platform for effective groundwater management and good water governance in this region, as groundwater provides a considerable base flow for the river and surrounding ecosystem to thrive. Creating a platform which ensures transparent institutional mechanism, sharing of knowledge, sharing of standard data, and improve strategy to incorporate all of the relevant stakeholders, including riparian communities, are needed for combating the current threat of climate change and make SDG 6.5.2 successful. Thank you. I am just finished my presentation, and thank you for this work.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was really, really interesting.
If any question, I can take it further.
Sure. If you have any question for Bidisha, please type them in the Q&A box and we'll pass them to her. In the meantime, we received a few questions for Andreas related to a lot of comments that they enjoyed the presentation, some of which have been already answered, but Andreas, if you don't mind, I will ask you to answer for those who haven't access to the chat.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Well, the first is, which is the formal agreement that serves as framework for the joint work of the countries you describe and for future cooperation in monitoring. So the Water Framework Directive, despite countries are not EU member, etc. Thank you.
Yeah, the work was done under this OIV Plus project, where the countries committed to work together and to implement the Water Framework Directive principles. And for Ukraine, the Water Framework Directive is an issue because it has an association agreement with the European Union, and it needs to elaborate river basin management plans until the year 2024. And this includes also transboundary coordination. And Belarus, on the other side, voluntarily agreed to also implement the spirit of the Water Framework Directive. It doesn't have these harsh deadlines like the association agreement countries have, but they also tried to implement the Water Framework Directive. But of course, this cooperation needs to be followed up by a legal framework. This work was just focused at the technical level.
Thank you. And there was another question related to also great comment that they enjoyed the presentation, and then some reference to groundwater pollution, which actually was mentioned in the presentation. That when we talk about transboundary aquifer, traditionally we think about water use and overexploitation. And in this case, the question was stressing about the pollution related to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant.
So in fact, we were running a groundwater survey, or we were supporting a groundwater survey in Belarus in this area, but not in this inner 30-kilometer cycle. And it showed clearly that the radiation levels and all the other substances which are correlated are below the limits in the country. So it's no longer a problem. The concentrations went down. But of course, we also were planning to have a transboundary bilateral monitoring survey between Belarus, together with Belarus and Ukraine. But unfortunately, due to the COVID crisis, it was no more possible to do it on the ground. But of course, we want to do that. And we also focus at those substances that are causing a risk that the water cannot be used anymore by human uses, or it gives effects, bad effects to ecosystems. But we try to keep on this problem.
Thank you. And let's hope that this pandemic will be over at some point very soon, so that we can all go back to the field as before.
There was also a follow-up comment on that again about it's difficult now to continue this work because the political situation in Belarus, between Belarus and the European Union, and at the moment it's not allowed for us to work further with Belarus. But we try to push the experts to do the work on their own without our support, because they are well experienced, they are the best experts in this region, so they can do it. And we also try, if it comes to radiation survey, we also try to involve the IAEA or maybe other academics. But the academic sector on this topic of radiation is very high. The level is very high in Belarus and Ukraine because they have a long-lasting experience on that.
Yeah, thank you. And it's important to stress that we never have to forget that they are local experts, that we, especially in international cooperation project, we really have to rely on them without interfering too much and trust their expertise and their approach and possible solution to the problems. So thank you for stressing that. Mm-hmm. We have another comment. Some question was about the conference proceeding, and Alberto Salinas replied that all the proceeding of the meetings and the recordings will be available on the website of ISARM. So if you're interested also to check all the proceeding, you can have a look at the website. We have time for maybe one last question related to the aquifer basin systems that are too large, that seems impractical to address the whole basin. So what about the hotspot of aquifer areas, and also when stakeholders are considered in the decision process? I think, Andres, this question is again for you, probably.
Yeah. when the aquifer systems are very large, then we came to the conclusion we have to cut them down in pieces which are manageable. And this is nothing else is requested by the Water Framework Directive. We have to cut the aquifers into pieces which are similar in the characterization, similar in their land use, and similar in their status, so that we can say this, and we call it groundwater body. These management units are called groundwater bodies. And we are dealing with that because when we have problems, we have to implement measures at the best place and the most effective place. And these groundwater bodies, if you have a big aquifer and which is divided into 20 groundwater bodies, for example, then you make a risk assessment and find out which are the groundwater bodies that are at risk, that have problems where you have to focus at. And in these groundwater bodies, you're investing your investigations, you're investing into monitoring, and then you're focusing the measures in these groundwater bodies. So I think these hotspots areas, these can be groundwater bodies, which you're focusing at. And the stakeholders, this is the next question, when are they considered? Within the Water Framework Directive approach, the stakeholders are considered in this public participation, but of course, if you want to implement the work properly, you involve them very early, you give them the information, you work transparent, and you involve them as the earliest stage, because finally, you don't want to have the problem that after several months and years of work, you're confronted by the stakeholders and then you are not able to continue anymore. So stakeholders also have a lot of information that is valuable and can bring an added value into your decision making.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your answer. And it would be nice to stay more to chat and discuss, but unfortunately we're running out of time. So I would like to thank all the speakers and the attendants and of course, the organizing committee and the interpreters for their work and your participation. And then I don't know if Alberto wants to say something. So I give the floor and I thank you all for participating to this session.
Yeah, thank you very much, Viviana, for this very nice and smooth coordination and development of this session. Just I would like to thank once again all the participants for the number of questions that we receive, and also the panelists, and inform that the next activity will be in more or less 1 hour time at 1:30 Paris time, on the panel 5 in the first channel of this conference, on draft article on the law of transboundary aquifer, do they hold water? And in our channel, we will coming back at 2:15. Again, with the same thematics on governance of transboundary water aquifers, strengthening cooperation. So I hope to see you in a few hours. And thank you again for all of you. Have a good break.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.